I would like to thank the Commission for giving me the opportunity to be here this morning. I strongly believe that in order to adequately defend our nation, we need to learn from the events of September 11th, and we need to understand why and how it happened. More importantly, we need to use what we learned to combat the terrorist threat that still exists against the United States. We can all agree that September 11th was the darkest day in our country's history. For the men and women of the New York City Police Department, it was a day marked by horror at what was occurring, sorrow for what we lost, and great pride in how we served and what we accomplished. We witnessed fearless dedication and unshakable courage in the face of death by the members of the NYPD and a response unprecedented by any local, state, or federal law enforcement agency in this country. Members of my executive team like John Picciano and Joe Dunn, field commanders like Joe Esposito, Bill Morange, Tom Pertel, and Deputy Commissioner Maureen Casey, and so many others, together with all the men and women of the NYPD, gave their all on September 11th, and some gave their very lives. Police officers like Detective Joseph Vigiano, who before September 11th had been involved in 2 separate gun battles and shot a total of 7 times, responded to the towers knowing the perils ahead. He lost his life, as did his brother John, one of the New York City Fire Department members. There was Sergeant John Coughlin, who once responded to my home when my 6-month-old daughter was choking. He died as well. Others that died included Mike, Maura, Rodney, Tim, Cloud, John D., Vinny, Jerry, Stephen, Mark, Robert, Ron, Tom, James, Brian, John P., Glenn, Ramon, Paul, Santos, and Wally. The true mark of their heroism, however, should not be measured only by the lives that were lost, but in what was accomplished in their final hours. Along with their brothers and sisters in the NYPD, their colleagues in the Port Authority Police, and their partners in the New York City Fire Department, they performed the greatest rescue mission in the history of our nation. Because of their courage and fortitude, over 25,000 mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, sons, and daughters made it home to their families that evening. And I'd like to spend the remainder of my time here today reviewing just how that job was accomplished. In carrying out its mission to protect and improve the quality of life for all New Yorkers, the men and women of the NYPD respond to crisis every day. And the department has always done that to the best of its ability. In 1996, Mayor Rudolph W. Giuliani improved the overall ability to respond to major events or emergencies with the creation of the Mayor's Office of Emergency Management. Together with other city agencies like the Fire Department, the Department of Transportation, and the Department of Health, the NYPD now had a more formalized mechanism to better plan, coordinate, and practice for just about any crisis you could imagine. The city, through its OEM, had coordinated plans for many types of emergencies, and those plans were tested frequently. Not only were drills and tabletop exercises conducted, like the one simulating a biochemical attack in the mass transit system, but actual emergencies like blackouts, building collapses, storms, plane crashes, and a West Nile virus outbreak all tested the effectiveness of the city's coordinated response system. We learned how to better communicate and coordinate operations among the various city agencies. We also learned how to better communicate with the stakeholders in the private sector, such as hospitals and utility companies, along with the state and federal agencies. I believe that all the planning, the drills, and actual emergencies that occurred prior to September 11th made us as prepared as we possibly could have been to handle the events of that day. We had established relationships with other agencies, both within and outside of city government. We had established protocols, and we had been tested, and we had the best trained emergency response personnel in the country. I believe we did our best based upon what we knew at the time. From the moment American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower, the men and women of the NYPD moved into action. Within minutes, officers from the 5 boroughs began a massive response that would include more than 20,000 officers by day's end. It was clear from the earliest moments after the first crash that the FDNY was responsible for the fire and rescue, and the NYPD was responsible for the safe evacuation of civilians from Lower Manhattan and for the security around the site, as well as the security for the rest of the city. Command posts and staging areas for emergency vehicles were immediately established at both ends of the World Trade Center. The initial NYPD NYPD command post was established at Church and Vesey Streets, and Chief of Department Joe Esposito was commanding operations from that location. The NYPD also had personnel at the FDNY's command post that was located off of West Street near the driveway of the World Financial Center in order to facilitate the exchange of information between the two departments. When the mayor and I stopped at the FDNY command post minutes after the second plane hit Tower 2 for an updated assessment of the situation, I personally spoke to the NYPD personnel present, including Sergeant John Coughlin from Emergency Services, who later died. An important point needs to be made here. Throughout my tenure as the police commissioner of the City of New York, I had a great relationship with the fire commissioner and his department. I did not see, or was I ever made aware of, an instance where there was a lack of coordination between our respective departments when it came to doing our jobs. There was a healthy competition between the two organizations, but we always had a common goal. We always came together to achieve that goal, which was to save lives. It had been done before, and it was certainly done again on September 11th. Within minutes after the first plane crash, more than half of the NYPD's Special Operations Division was deployed, all in an effort to assist in the rescue. Under the direction of the FDNY, emergency services personnel began to equip themselves for crash site entry. Our aviation unit helicopters were airborne over Manhattan. Our harbor unit launches were at Riverside. And communication links were established between the commanders of those of the fire department, the Port Authority, and the FBI. At the moment that the second plane hit, the crisis shifted from its initial horror to indisputable homeland warfare, and the character, professionalism, and bravery of New York's finest was never more evident. As debris showered down to the ground, as fellow human beings jumped to their death, from 100 stories above, there was no retreat and no hesitation. The officers that ran for cover as Flight 175 crashed above ran even faster back toward the two towers filled with strangers that desperately needed their help. While the rescue efforts were ongoing, other plans were put into action by the NYPD in order to respond to the attack and protect the city. For example, Operation Omega, the city's highest state of alert, was initiated. We were also trying to anticipate other possible secondary targets in and around the city, as we did not know just how many planes were unaccounted for. Accordingly, potential secondary targets, including the UN, City Hall, and police headquarters, were evacuated. As the security and enormity of the crisis escalated, so did our response. Together, teams of emergency services officers and firefighters continued to climb the staircases in search of trapped victims. Rescue workers gave aid to the injured on the streets, and officers established rescue routes for people exiting the towers as well as those evacuating other buildings in the area. Bridges and tunnels leading into Manhattan were all closed except to emergency vehicles. In coordination with the Federal Aviation Authority, the NYPD's aviation unit secured the airspace over Manhattan. Additional officers were mobilized to secure the rapidly extending perimeter. A makeshift executive command post was established several blocks away at an office building at 75 Barclay Street in order to give the mayor and I and other agency heads an opportunity to regroup and re-strategize based on the latest developments. At approximately 10 a.m., despite the most courageous and valiant of efforts, both the enormity and the dynamic of the catastrophe shifted once again as the South Tower collapsed, and hundreds of police and firefighters and thousands of innocent civilians lost their lives. In that moment, our isolation from the brutality of terrorism was gone. Our landscape was altered and our nation was forever changed. Yet even before the plumes of ash and pulverized concrete began to lift, before anyone could rationally assess what had just occurred or what the next blow may be, the men and women of the NYPD, the fire department, and our city's emergency medical teams were racing back into the center of the disaster. They ran into the pile that had just claimed the lives of their brothers and sisters, and they did not stop digging for 8 months. Emergency workers continued to evacuate the North Tower. The perimeter at Ground Zero was extended even further in resigned acceptance that the second tower could at any minute follow the first. Any and all means of transporting the injured and those trying to escape were employed. Hundreds were carried to Harbor Unit launches and ferried across the river to New Jersey, and tens of thousands were guided over the Brooklyn Bridge. At 10:28 a.m., The same tragic events were cruelly repeated as the North Tower collapsed, claiming more lives, leveling more destruction, and again beating back the rescue effort. Again, though, the courageous returned and the work continued. More personnel and resources were mobilized. Heavy equipment was brought in to dig out those buried under the rubble. Lower Manhattan, south of 14th Street, from the Hudson to the East River, was frozen to all but emergency service personnel. The affected area south of Hudson Street was divided into 7 patrol zones in order to direct the evacuation, secure the crime scene, and stabilize the surrounding neighborhoods. By afternoon, the new Command and Control Center was established at the NYPD Police Academy, located on East 20th Street. Within hours after the first plane striking the North Tower, a fully functional multi-agency command center was operating, manned by representatives from every federal, state, and local agency and organization participating in the rescue and recovery effort. By mid-afternoon, Mayor Giuliani and Governor Pataki were able to convene the first of what would become a steady stream of multi-agency meetings with the heads of the city police, fire, and health departments, among others, sitting alongside relief agencies like FEMA to ensure that the response was immediate, coordinated, and comprehensive. Over the hours and days that followed, the news would be grim. The emergency rooms would remain empty. Our hope of finding survivors would dissipate, and we would learn that more than 2,700 people had lost their lives, including 23 members of my department, 37 Port Authority police, and 343 members of the fire department. Yet the fierce determination to protect our city, our ideals, and our American way of life that was so present in the first minutes of the attack grew to even larger dimensions.
Commissioner, if you could start to sum up.
Yes, sir.
On time.
And led additional accomplishments that few have thought possible. A complete list of what was accomplished by the men and women of the NYPD is simply too extensive to provide in this forum, but I thank you and the Commission members for giving me the opportunity to highlight some of their achievements and the achievements of the 23 valiant heroes who died that day. In terms of lessons learned, I think a few points should be made. First, emergency operations centers with a single agency responsible for its operation, similar to the one in New York City, are essential. Relationships and response plans must be well established before an emergency occurs. You just can't make them happen in the midst of a crisis. Second, success in securing our homeland requires accurate and real-time intelligence that is shared with all the necessary stakeholders, whether they are at the local, state, or federal level. There must be an internal monitoring system that will ensure efficiency and accountability with regard to information sharing and communications. A culture change in intelligence and information sharing is essential, and those that refuse to change must be removed. There can be no compromise. Finally, I believe our battles against terrorism have only just begun. Removing the Taliban and al-Qaeda leadership from Afghanistan and Saddam Hussein and his regime from Iraq were just the beginning in addressing the real threats against us. We must stand firm, stay preemptive, and never believe for 1 minute that this war is over. They brought this war to us, and it's a war we cannot afford to lose. I ask this Commission to put politics aside, put our freedom first, and give us the ammunition we need to continue the battle before us, for without it, we lose. Thank you.